Hello, my name's Tim Malone and I'm a history teacher. And today we're going to talk about Puritanism in American history. Puritanism, of course, brought to what would become the United States by the Puritans. Perry Miller, the foremost historian of Puritanism, the New England Mind, he wrote a book called The New England Mind, 3 volumes. I read it years ago, and very dense, very convoluted. Perry Miller calls Puritanism one of the major expressions of the Western intellect. That Puritanism achieved an organized synthesis of concepts which are fundamental to our culture today. Puritanism, this is according to Perry Miller, is of immense historical importance, and it was the most coherent and most powerful single factor in the development of early America. Miller says the Puritans were the founders of the American nation. Whoa, pretty heavy stuff. According to Perry Miller, scratch an American, find a Puritan. To this day, we were founded as a Puritan nation. Now, of course, Puritanism is an ideology. It's a system of thought. It's religious, of course. The Puritans were intensely religious. Puritanism was one of the foremost manifestations of Protestantism, the Protestant Reformation, the movement initiated by Martin Luther in 1517 in Germany, when Martin Luther, an intellectual priest, Roman Catholic priest, split with the church, unleashed a wave of efforts at reform of the church, the Catholic Church, a splintering, the foundation of numerous Protestant churches. Of course, Luther was Lutheranism. Puritans were a manifestation of the Reformation in England. Now, today, I don't think most Americans think of Puritan and Puritanism as the founding ideology of the American nation. And I don't know, what do you think if someone calls you a Puritan today? It's not a compliment, right? It's considered to be an insult almost. You're a Puritan. Because Puritanism has come to mean, primarily, I think, intolerant. And we'll see with the next lecture about the Salem witch trials, perhaps murderous. Well, vis-a-vis Native Americans, the Puritans were murderous. I don't know. I mean, of course, Perry Miller showed the inclination of historians to fall in love with their subjects. So, of course, Perry Miller thinks Puritanism is of the utmost importance. That's what he studied. But I don't think he's exaggerating too much. Puritanism is very important in the development of the United States. And I think a lot of Americans don't appreciate how Puritanism has affected the development of the United States. The Puritans settled in what is now Boston in 1630. Now, of course, 1607 is generally considered the beginning of English colonization in North America with the founding of Jamestown, Virginia, and the Chesapeake Bay. The second major point of entry for English colonists is the Boston area in 1630, when the Puritans came. Puritanism, as I said, was a major manifestation of the European Reformation. The Puritans were Calvinists who wanted to purify the Church of England, thus the name, which they believed had remained too Roman under the reforms of Henry VIII. Very quickly, right? Luther, 1517. Henry VIII, the King of England, originally opposed Protestantism, wrote a treatise that the Pope praised and denominated Henry VIII defender of the faith. But Henry VIII was very clever, smart guy, and it dawned on him at some point that if he joined the Protestant movement, he could seize the Catholic Church's property in England. And it was about a quarter of all the land in England was owned by the church. So I don't know. I think Henry was not necessarily, he was being utilitarian. He left the Catholic Church and formed the Church of England, which still exists to this day. And pretty much what Henry did was he left everything the same: the Mass, the sacraments, the vestments, the statues, which on the continent were in the crosshairs with Lutherans and others as they revolted against the formalism of the Catholic Church. All Henry did was take the Pope off the top and put himself in there. The rest of it was all going to stay the same. And as you know, the Queen of England today is still the head of the Church of England. Well, that wasn't enough for a lot of Englishmen. And they wanted the Puritans, thus the name, the Puritans said, Henry hasn't gone far enough. We want a more secular, we want the vestments done away with, the incense, the Latin, the hierarchy, the bishops and cardinals. We want all that gone. We want a more thoroughgoing reform. However, they didn't want to leave the Church of England. This is going to create problems, right? This is going to create problems. They wanted to stay in the Church of England, but they wanted to purify it. That's like a quick rundown. Now, Puritanism appealed to the merchant class in England. Puritanism attracted the rich and powerful, not the nobles, not the aristocratic class. In fact, the Puritans will come to be sworn enemies of English aristocracy. But the English were lawyers and merchants and secular landowners, the gentry. It appealed to those people, and that class of people was rising in power in England as England came to dominate the Atlantic economy. We talked about this Atlantic economy when we talked about slavery in the last lecture. As England came to become the predominant power in the Atlantic economy, a class of Englishmen became wealthy and powerful, and they became the Puritans. And so it wasn't easy. Now, the Puritans complained a lot about being oppressed, right? But not so much. They were too powerful to be oppressed. And of course, in the English Civil War, which will break out in the 1640s, the Puritans against the Royalists, the Puritans will win that war and cut the head off the king, King Charles. They'll execute the king, the Puritans under Oliver Cromwell. And they'll rule England for 10 years as a dictatorship, and they'll do away with the House of Lords. The Puritans became anti-aristocratic. Well, they chopped the head off the king. What more need be said? And then ultimately, of course, Cromwell dies. His son tries to rule for a year or so. And then there's a counter-revolution of sorts, and a king, the brother of the slain king, is brought back, right? But England's never the same, right? That revolution, Parliament becomes supreme, even though they bring the king back. Puritanism appealed in England to the middle class. It's a middle class movement. Now, whether I should pause here and talk about socioeconomic class for a minute, right? Socioeconomic class. Now, of course, in an aristocratic society, and all human societies and polities were aristocratic, almost all of them, throughout history, up until the Puritans take over England for a while, and then, of course, the United States, right, the new nation, the Constitution of the new nation, the United States of America, will outlaw aristocracy, which is very revolutionary at the time. We don't think twice about it now, because blue-blooded aristocracies kind of went out, right? They just kind of went away as a result of modernization, some people would say. The middle class, what a concept, right? The middle class. In a traditional society through most of human history, right, you had an aristocracy that ruled, and what? The aristocracy was single digits percent of the population at the most. Just before the French Revolution in 1789, what, 0.5% of the French population were aristocrats, and they ruled everybody else? 0.5%. Now, of course, historically, aristocracies always had their hangers-ons, their officials, their armies, their thugs, right? And usually that came to about 10%, sometimes even less. And so, listen to this, right? Historically, traditionally, most of the political regimes, empires and kingdoms and city-states that existed, 10% ruled 90%. That's the norm. 10% ruling 90%, and sometimes very violently and very oppressively. Now we tend to think, oh, come on, let's all get together, the 90, let's rush them, right? But domination is complicated. It happens as much in people's minds as it does the result of who has the guns. So the middle class, Puritanism is a middle class phenomenon in England. The Puritans had trouble with the Stuart kings in the early 17th century. Well, I guess they cut the head off one. And planned and organized a settlement of America as a venture to create a shining city on a hill as a model for England to follow. So in other words, the Puritans come to America in 1630. They won't cut the head off the king in England and take over England until 1642. So the Puritan mission to America precedes their seizing power in England. And the Puritans, again, are rich. They're resourceful. And they planned this mission to America to create a utopia. There's utopian aspects to the Puritan settlement of America. And again, historians say, yes, because there's still utopian elements to the American creed today, right? Americans still think of themselves as a utopia, the best place, the shining city on a hill. That was the term for John Winthrop, the leader of this expedition to America in 1630, who the night before they made landfall in Boston area, he gathered his lieutenants together and he gave a speech, which we still have a copy of. That's one of the things about Puritanism. They wrote everything down. And he said, you know, we're here to create a shining city on a hill, which is a biblical reference. Jesus talked about the shining city on the hill. So again, let me repeat. There's a utopian aspect to the founding of the Puritan colony in the New World, and that is one of the key aspects of American exceptionalism. The Puritans were the founders, the progenitors of this idea of American exceptionalism, the shining city on a hill. Doesn't everybody want to live in the American utopia we're going to create? The Puritans in America were theocratic and intolerant. Because of their beliefs in predestination and a social covenant between the Puritan elect and God, the Puritans sought to control the moral climate of their society. The elect, those predestined for heaven, were responsible for the morality of all the persons in their community. This "we have to watch everybody" idea is cited by historians as the foundation of recurring American fits of witch hunt, prohibition, and moral crusade. The elect. The Puritans believed in predestination. That's a Calvinistic idea. John Calvin, a Frenchman who fled to Geneva, Switzerland, one of the big three of Protestantism, Luther, Calvin, and Henry VIII. Calvinism, predestination. Predestination is the idea that you can't earn your way to heaven. You're predetermined from all of eternity by God who's going to go to heaven and who isn't. Now, as an old Catholic myself, who's struggling for grace and brownie points in heaven, and who believes in a big scoreboard up there, and that when you die, your soul's going to get put on the scales, your good works and your bad works. Predestination is kind of a foreign idea. You can't do the predestination, the Puritans, Calvinists, you can't earn your way to heaven. You're predestined. Well, you think, well, why be good? Well, because you're supposed to show your electness by being good. And the elect are supposed to rule the earthly community. Good question. What percentage of the people are elect? Well, the Puritans, of course, and the Calvinists are not real precise about that. I don't know, about 10% is what historians come down to. Again, the 10%, right? About 10% of the people are elect, and they prove it to each other. And there's a conversion experience in Puritanism. In other words, there's the elect, and they're running the show, and they have a committee. And so Joe Blow is out with his oxen plowing the South 40, and there's always a natural phenomenon involved, and lightning strikes the oak tree, and God reveals to Joe that he's of the elect. So he goes to the committee of the elect, and he says, last Wednesday I was out plowing the South 40, and lightning struck the oak tree, and God said I was of the elect. And the council of the elect will go, okay, Joe, you're in. Now, you can say, holy moly, does that system ever sound ripe for corruption? Sons and daughters and grandsons and relatives? Yeah, you're in. Again, to an old Catholic, predestination doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But they were Calvinists, and they believed in predestination. And the elect ran the show. And God, and the Puritan God is like an Old Testament God. He's vengeful, and he's hard. He's a hard God. And he doesn't take a lot of guff, the Puritan God. And he's not forgiving, loving God. He's harsh. He's a stern master. And he expects the elect to provide a holy community. So the elect watch everybody. Again, only 10% are of the elect. Now, everybody else, most everybody else, because again, the Puritans are intolerant. You can't get off the boat in Boston in 1650 and be a Catholic. You can't say, oh yeah, I'm getting off the boat here. I'm a Catholic. Man, you'd be seized and you'd be expelled, if not beaten up and tortured. Again, you're saying, oh, this Puritanism is crazy, man. It's crazy. Yes, it is. And it's suffered for its craziness. Puritanism is internally conflicted, right? And that's one of the key elements of it that historians note. And this tension causes trouble. For one thing, they're always booting people out. Roger Williams gets booted out and goes founds Rhode Island. Hooker gets booted out and goes founds Connecticut. They're always booting people out. They're intolerant. They get in trouble with the English government, and we'll talk later about the relationship between the Puritan colony. The Puritans would say, we ain't no stinking colony. But, well, what exactly were they? They get in trouble with the English government when they hang a couple of Quakers who show up in Boston and say, we're Quakers. Oh, yeah, okay. And they hang them. They're intolerant in that way, the Puritans. And but they're supposed to watch. In other words, a Puritan, if you're of the elect Puritans, yeah, I'm looking in your window. Yeah, I'm listening to your conversations. You know? Yeah. And I'm watching. Are you a witch? Right? Are you preaching heresy? Puritanism. I could spend a lot of time on the theology of Puritanism, and I might come back to it a little bit later. It's crazy, and it's intense. And most historians think that Puritanism in America, the Boston area, right, 1630, the founding of it, but by 1700, it's burned itself out. That the intensity was too much. That Puritanism expected too much from the Puritans. And that it was fiery, hot Puritanism, and it just couldn't maintain. And by 1700, and it's funny because the pendulum goes from intense religious in New England, it goes over to kind of secularism. They kind of reject, after 70 years of intense Puritan fire, they kind of go the other way, New England, and become more secular and more tolerant. And of course, that's where the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement, will be focused, is in New England. Now, the Puritans, just an aside here, the Puritans didn't want slaves in their colony and didn't allow slaves in their colony. However, they built ships, sent them to Africa to bring slaves to the South. They weren't opposed to making money on the slave trade, but they didn't want them here. No slaves here. We'll take them somewhere else and pocket the money. Puritanism. All intellectual histories of the United States, all literary histories of the United States begin with Puritanism and the Puritans. In grad school, I hung out with English majors, and of course I took English, American lit classes, American literature, the study of American literature. They all start with the Puritans. And early, Hawthorne and Melville and who's up? They're all from the New England area. New England is the birthplace of American literature. And it's not surprising because the Puritans had this thing about writing stuff down. The Puritans wrote everything down. Literally, almost everything. And so historians have a vast archive of primary sources for the Puritans. Some have noted that that's the reason the Puritans are so prominent in American history, because there's so many sources, which tells you about history. Perhaps one of the drawbacks of history, historians go where the sources are. And there's this vast trove of written sources for Puritans, and so Puritans loom large in history. It's a cause and effect relationship. The Puritans brought a printing press with them and their first wave of settlers. And by the way, you know the story in Virginia, Jamestown, 1607, the first couple of years in Jamestown where they're cannibalizing each other to survive. There's no such thing happening in New England. There's 2,000 come in the first wave of the Puritan invasion of America, John Winthrop's group, 2,000. Like 15 ships, hoes and rakes and axes and a printing press. And the Puritans were businessmen. They were hard-headed. They were well prepared. They'll found Harvard University in 1636. 6 years after they show up, they create a college. Now, of course, it's for educating Puritan ministers, but still, it shows a dedication to learning, to intellectual pursuits. The Puritans, they still, people still say the Boston area is the intellectual capital of the United States. A legacy of these intolerant and in some ways look back upon foolish, I don't know, is that the right word? Yes, Puritanism and education, universal compulsory education, we talked about that, the university, and again, like teachers from New England, teachers trained in New England will dominate the teaching of grade schools in this area here in northern Illinois until around 1900. Often in those rural schools that were mandated by the Northwest Ordinance 1787, the teachers were from New England. I want to stress again the idea that the Puritans were in favor of universal compulsory education. You can make the case that that idea has had a profound effect on the history of human beings, the world writ large. Of course, the reason that the Puritans wanted everybody to read is so they could read the Bible, which of course is one of the basic tenets of the Reformation, the break with the Catholic Church. One of the first things Luther does when he breaks with the Church is he prints the Bible in German. The Catholic Church had prohibited the publication of the Bible in the Vulgate, as it's called, the common language of the area. That's one of the things that Protestantism rebels against. Between 1640 and 1700, the literacy rate in Massachusetts Bay Colony is 95%, which again, as I said, makes it the most literate place in the world. And it will remain such for years. Let's talk about, and again, the Puritans, it's kind of contradictory that they're so in favor of literacy and so restrictive and intolerant of other ideas, other systems of thought other than their own. I want to talk a little bit about Puritanism and capitalism. Of course, we'll come back in future lectures and talk more about the history of capitalism in the United States. We've already talked about it when we talked about slavery. Capitalism. A lot of historians think that Puritanism played a crucial role in the development of American capitalism. The Puritans were big on contractual theories of religion. There's the social contract, where, again, the elect think of themselves as in an agreement, a contract with God. God informs them that they are of the elect. That's what he does. And what do they do for God? They run a holy community. They ride herd on everybody. It's a contract. They were big on the contractual theory of religion because, again, the Puritanism appealed to the merchant class in England. So they were susceptible to that way of viewing the world. And they were middle class. Now, again, the Puritans had usury laws. They controlled the interest rate. Interest rates were controlled in the Puritan community. They had sumptuary laws. What's that? That's where it was against the law. You could get as rich as you wanted to be in Puritan New England, but you couldn't show off. They had sumptuary laws. No gold carriages, no fancy houses. You could be rich as the devil, but you had to live like everybody else by the law. Sumptuary laws. Now I know that's just like, Whoa, the modern American. Whoa. You know what I mean? If that was in effect now, Bill Gates would like be living next to me in a house just like me. He wouldn't be able to have a chauffeured Rolls Royce. Yeah. So again, you can make an argument that the Puritans weren't capitalists. But perhaps they're the progenitors of American capitalism because they were so commercially minded, because they believed in the contractual theory of not only religion but life. So that, there's debate about how capitalistic the Puritans were. Oh, now here's another. Puritans' impact on American democracy. The Puritans were not democratic, small d. The elect, originally when the Puritans showed up, only people who could vote were the elect. That's about 10% of the population. However, within a few years, they decided that they were going to let everybody, well, free white males over 21 who owned a certain amount of property, they're going to let everybody vote. Why did they relent on this, only the elect can vote? It's an interesting phenomenon that takes place in all of the colonies, English colonies. For example, North Carolina was founded by hardcore feudalists. North Carolina was founded by men who were going to come and build manor houses and import peasants. Going to be like England. That didn't work at all. Why not? Well, this is an interesting aspect of American history, that Native Americans played a key role in the democratization of the English colonies. Because of the Native Americans, because of the frontier and the resistance of Native Americans, the colonial governments had to arm every able-bodied citizen to fight the Indians. You couldn't have only 10% running the show. You had to give the vote and a gun to every able-bodied man to resist the Native Americans. The Native American threat abetted the democratization of colonial governments. So this rule by the elect didn't last. They had to give the vote to every able-bodied citizen because they needed every able-bodied citizen in the militia to defend the colony. So, again, how democratic were the Puritans? What's their role in the development, the history of American democracy? Some, a little. Now, it is true that the Puritans developed the township, county meeting form of government, where every citizen came to a meeting once a year and voted for the leaders for that year in an open meeting, which a lot of political scientists say, there's the kernel, there's the wellspring of American democracy, the New England town meeting. And it is true that the Puritan colony developed into that open meeting where every man was supposed to show up and vote for their leaders for the next year. But again, we white men over 21 who owned a certain amount of property, we wouldn't call that a democracy today. But it's, again, and let me say this generally, right? As you probably guessed, I got a heavy dose of Puritanism in grad school at Northern Illinois University because I took classes from George Spencer. No, wait, wrong guy. Stephen Foster, who graduated from Harvard, who studied under Edmund Morgan, who studied under Perry Miller. Remember him, the original guy? And that's how academia works. Perry Miller, Edmund Morgan, Stephen Foster, Tim Malone. Puritanism flowed downhill, right? So the NIU history department gave its students a heavy dose of Puritanism. So I got a heavy dose of Puritanism. So welcome to the chain, the Puritan chain. right? But I agree, I'm an intellectual historian. I believe ideas are important. And Puritanism is an idea. It's a religious aspect. It's a political viewpoint. It's a cultural viewpoint. And I think scratch an American, find a Puritan. I think there's something to that. Now, of course, the Puritans were Congregationalists. That was again one of the elements of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. Of course, the Catholic Church is the quintessential authoritarian structure, top down, right? Pope, cardinals, bishops, priests, right? Top down. Do what you say. Do what I tell you. Follow orders. And of course, part of the Protestant Reformation was a revolt against that. And so you get Congregationalism. In the Catholic Church, the church appoints the priest. Under Congregationalism, the congregation decides on who's going to be the minister. Under Quakerism, there is no minister at all. Right? I mean, it's like anybody could get up in a Quaker meeting and run, sort of preside. The Puritans were Congregationalists. And again, historians say Congregationalism has democratic implications. The congregation is sovereign. There isn't a hierarchy. Now that depends. Lutheranism has bishops, and Presbyterians has presbyters. I mean, it's like a spectrum of hierarchy amongst Protestant churches, Baptists. Anybody can get a degree from some Baptist school and go rent a hall and start a Baptist church. Congregationalism, and there's still Puritan churches, Congregationalists. I mean, there's a Congregationalist church in my town. Congregationalism is a direct offspring of the Puritan church that came to America in 1630. It's very different in ideology now, of course. Oh, well, I want to come back briefly to the idea of Puritanism and the idea of public morality. Public morality. To a Puritan, it matters what you do in the privacy of your own home. To a Puritan, even though you're in your own bedroom with your wife, behind the curtains are drawn and you're being quiet, it matters what you do. And the Puritan citizen has the right to check up on you. Yes, Puritans look through their neighbors' windows to see what they're doing. Because the idea is that even private immorality is going to call down the wrath of God. And God will punish the entire community if the elect don't police the behavior of everyone in the community. Does that sound familiar at all? I mean, does that sound familiar? I mean, right now, we have a debate in this country about abortion, right? Which Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court said there's a right to privacy. It may not be explicitly listed in the Bill of Rights, but remember, Amendment 9 in the Bill of Rights says, just because we've listed these rights in this Bill of Rights doesn't mean there aren't others that we haven't covered. That's in the Bill of Rights. These aren't the only rights. So when people say, well, the right to privacy is not in the Constitution, well, it doesn't have to be a bona fide right. And the Supreme Court said there's a right to privacy. Not for Puritans, there's no right to privacy. No, there's a, it's the old slippery slope argument, right? You get too much degeneracy, even behind closed doors, and God's going to know, and He's going to punish you. Collective punishment. And literally the Puritans believed it would be a drought or insect infestation or Indian attacks on the frontier. That, God would literally send a hurricane if your community slipped below a certain level of morality. And again, that's just, it's so prevalent. Now, I guess it's prevalent in other societies and other countries. It's not just the United States, but I think the United States is known for this idea that there's such a thing as public morality, and it's every citizen's duty to uphold public morality, and it matters what your neighbor does in the privacy of his home. And that traces back to the Puritans. Now let's talk about Puritanism and American exceptionalism. Whoa, American exceptionalism. What a concept. We're going to come back to American exceptionalism in future lectures. American exceptionalism. What's that? That's the idea that the United States of America is special. Now you're going to say, well, doesn't every country think they're special? Isn't that part of nationalism writ large? Every country thinks they're special? Yeah. But no, the United States, we think we're extra special. We're the shining city on a hill. And oh man, a couple of weeks ago, we withdrew our last troops from Afghanistan, where we were involved in a 20-year nation-building effort, where the United States goes to some other country and attempts to, what? It didn't work. It didn't work in South Vietnam either. You can argue about South Korea. You can argue about some places. You can, to say that American nation-building efforts, the American effort to say, here, we'll show you how to do this. Okay? Because, of course, you want to be like us, right? That's the tenet of American exceptionalism. And it's absolutely true that the Puritans came to America to set up a utopian community from scratch, right? The wilderness, because Native Americans don't count. From scratch to show the world how to do it. Now, of course, the Puritans weren't the only peoples to migrate to America with utopian aspirations. There were other groups too. But they're the most famous and perhaps the most explicit about that shining city on a hill bit. And it resonates, right? And it resonates. And the American failure in Afghanistan is a blow against American exceptionalism. And we talked about the fact that there are state governments, and again, Texas comes to mind, there's others, where the legislature, the governor, are trying to legislate what can be taught in American history classes in the public schools in Texas. And one of the terms I heard was that they want to teach, to buff up the idea of American exceptionalism. They want American high school, grade school and high school students taught that America is special. That not only are we special, we're extra special. And what does it mean? It means that of course, everyone wants to be like us. And we're going to give the gift of Americanness to other countries. And what's wrong with them Afghanis? What's wrong with them? Rejected. What's wrong with them Vietnamese? What's wrong with them Iraqis? Everybody wants to be like us. It goes without saying. American exceptionalism. And most Americans, right, are American exceptionalists, right? Where does it come from? The Puritans. The Puritans set the germ of American exceptionalism, which still prevails and which still causes war. American exceptionalism, the shining city on a hill. Blame the Puritans. Boy, we're blaming the Puritans for a lot, aren't we? Puritan theology, a predestination, a conversion experience, covenant of grace, social covenant, the state covenant. Oh yeah, the Puritans believed that their government was in a special relationship with God. Have you heard that one before? The government has a covenant, a contract with God. Then, of course, there's the Puritan ethic. And then Puritan theology, I mentioned this before, splintered off offshoots. They were kicking people out all the time. It didn't unify, despite its intolerance and its effort at ideological and religious unity. Quite the opposite was the result. Puritanism splintered. Now, Protestantism writ large, from Luther on down, splinters, has a splintering effect. There's new Protestant churches being founded to this day. It's inherent in Protestantism. It's inherent in Puritanism. It splinters off groups. Oh, the political history of Puritanism, really quickly. When John Winthrop brought those 2,000 people to America in 1630, and you said to him, "Way to go, John, you're founding an English colony in America," he'd say, "Colony? What do you mean, colony?" Now, the Puritans were loyal Englishmen, and so what did John Winthrop think the relationship was between the Boston colony and the English government? We don't know. It was purposefully left ambiguous. It wasn't until, when? It wasn't until after the Boston colony was thriving that English government even set up a ministry of colonies. It predated the government office to regulate it and watch it. So of course there's going to be trouble. And there always was trouble. Interminable trouble. The English Puritan colony squabbled with the English government. Even when Cromwell, the Puritan dictator, was ruling England for those 10 years, there was trouble between the Puritans about what's the status of this colony. What can we tell you to do? What can we expect you to do? There was trouble all the time. And again, when we get to the American Revolution, we'll make the point that the idea that these colonies should be independent, or that there's a debate about what the status is not new in 1776, especially with the Puritans in the Boston area. There's a long tradition of trouble between England and the Puritans. And like I said, they'll get in trouble for hanging Quakers. They'll get in trouble for their relationship with Native Americans. Not surprisingly, the English government didn't want perpetual war on the frontier. The Puritans were very aggressive vis-a-vis the Native Americans. Oh yeah, and let's talk about the dark side of the force, right? The dark side of Puritanism. We talked about education and democracy and capitalism. The dark side of the force, like I said, Puritans and Native Americans, the Puritans pursued extinctionist policies towards Native Americans. There were several massacres in the early years of where the Puritans wiped out entire villages. There's also this splintering, this persecution of heretics and anybody who was of a different religion. And then, of course, there's the witch hunts. The witch hunts, which is what we're going to turn to next. We're going to have a lecture on the Salem witch hunts, which, while they're a small incident in history, offers, I think, unique insights into American history, American development, and history writ large.